Welcome to another edition of Dissecting Horror, your virtual panel series. From Dread Central, I'm your host, Josh Millican, and tonight, from the most talented composers in the arena of horror soundtracks. This really is an all-star panel. Not only that, I'm very lucky to be joined by another great musician who's also a writer and a journalist. I'm talking about Blake Fichera, the author of Scored to Death and Scored to Death 2. How's it going, Blake? I'm not hearing you, Blake.
It's going great.
Oh, there, I can hear you now.
See some familiar faces.
Fantastic.
You can hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now for sure.
I was going to say it's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really lucky to have you. Obviously, people who've tuned in before know that I'm a huge horror fan, but I'm not a musician, so having you here with your expertise is really going to add a lot. Real quick, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Technical difficulties.
Well, my name is J. Blake Fichera. As you mentioned, I'm the author of the book Scored to Death.
Mm-hmm.
Again?
Seem to be having a little bit of a delay.
Freezing or audio just leaving?
I don't know. It's almost like a full delay. Hey, those of you watching along, that's
I don't know. You sound fine to me.
Technology. John, tech guy, John Condit. Do we have any advice for Blake about these audio delays? All right, no worries.
Should I just jump off and jump back on?
No. What about? Did you hear John's advice about the decrease in the quality of your camera?
We were doing so good.
I know. Well, we are doing good. I mean, it's fine to. Yeah, and that's why we're doing this co-moderator thing. While you experiment a little bit there, I'm gonna let everyone know who we've got with us. First of all, we've got Charlie Clouser. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Oh, fantastic. So glad to have you here. You came up back in the day playing with some bands that we've all heard of, like Nine Inch Nails and White Zombie. Since gone on to have this really extensive career scoring films. Most of the Saw films, including the newest entry, Spiral from the Book of Saw, which I've seen, I love. So congratulations on that. So glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, for the folks watching the stream, Blake's gonna hop on, hop off, hop back on, kind of getting a little peek behind the curtain as we reshuffle everything, but we're not going to let that slow us down or stop us, because like I said, this is legitimately an all-star panel, and I'm so glad to have these people here. Next, I want to introduce Mark Korven, coming to us from Toronto this evening. Mark, how are you?
Excellent.
Mark specializes in world music, and I think most of you guys watching will know his work from The Witch and The Lighthouse, the two films of Robert Eggers. Immensely talented, just some wonderful work you did in that really creepy period horror space. So that's just amazing. So glad to have you here. John, can you keep your eye on the waiting room to see if Blake is coming back? I'm not sure if I missed him or not, but thank you so much for being here, Mark. Next up for me, just going down the windows here, is Joseph Bishara, no stranger to horror fans. How are you, sir?
Doing great, thanks.
Oh man, we are so stoked to have you here. For people who don't know, you scored most, if not all, of the Conjuring films, I believe, including the upcoming Conjuring film, The Devil Made Me Do It. But besides that, you pop up in some of these films too, with some amazing creature actor skills. So the dim light is totally fitting because you really are this multifaceted composer slash actor, who's a part of so many of these films coming out that we know and love. So really happy to have you here. Last but not least, we've got Christopher Young. Again, people who know horror film scores know Christopher Young. We could do an entire episode with just you going over your really distinguished career. But I think, for starters, something that everyone's going to know about right away is you did the theme to Hellraiser and Hellraiser 2. Am I correct?
That's right. That's right.
Fantastic.
Some 127 years ago.
Right.
But it was a while ago. Very lucky to have been on board those for sure.
Yeah. We can only imagine the stories you have and the things you've seen and heard along the way. So again, we're super happy to have you here. This really is just like a power panel, a wonderful ensemble. Blake, how you doing there, buddy?
Is this any better?
Oh my God, it's so much better.
All right,
it's
good.
Like we're on the same plane, we're on the same, time zone. Yeah. So glad to have you here. I took it upon myself to interview these guys who you actually know. I think except for one of these people, you've met them all before, and I think they've even been involved in your book.
Yes.
Again, tell us real quickly about Scored to Death, and then we'll launch in grilling these guys.
The first Scored to Death book, Scored to Death Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers, came out in 2016. And it's in-depth interviews with 14 wonderful composers, including Joseph and Christopher, who are with us today. And then late last year, I followed it up with Scored to Death 2. And Charlie was nice enough to contribute to that one. And Chris actually wrote the afterword for Scored to Death 2. So I know those three guys really well, but I've never had the pleasure of talking to Mark. And so I'm very excited to meet him.
Well, fantastic. And, again, like I was saying, I'm really happy to have you here.
Get started then.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's get started. Why don't you take the lead on questioning these guys since you've got the knowledge to get really into the weeds with them all?
Gosh, mung.
Sure. One of the things that I've discussed with most of you guys is, am I delayed again? Is that what's happening?
Perhaps. I think you're slowing down again. Yeah, we're definitely getting some delays.
Well, that's disappointing.
Hey, John, do you have any advice for our co-moderator? Again, we've got John Condit running tech. Just have Blake be the hidden co-moderator. All right. So long visual of Blake, but hopefully you're still there.
How's
Blake,
that?
you there? I mean, it sounds good to me.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you. Are we all aligned?
Okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah, let me just while we work this out with Blake, again, apologize. Glad those of you who are bearing with us, like we said, this is technology in the age we live in. But Charlie, you and I were talking a little bit during Tech Check about Spiral, which just came out. A new direction, new chapter in the Saw franchise, Spiral from the Book of Saw. And one of your colleagues was asking a little bit about what's it like having basically the film's been in limbo for the past year. What's it like now that it's finally seen the light of day?
Well, like I was saying, I was actually really glad that Lionsgate and the producers like held firm and didn't just dump it on HBO Max or on video on demand, because there's a social component to seeing a Saw movie on opening weekend in a theater, hopefully with someone's girlfriend screaming and throwing popcorn up in the air. And it's gratifying that it didn't just kind of disappear into the murk of COVID releases, where, you know, a lot of movies that were on the schedule for this past year, the studios just couldn't wait any longer, just said, screw it. And they jammed it out on whatever channel they could stick it on. So it was nice that that they held out for this, because that they timed it just perfectly, because at least in Los Angeles and in a lot of parts of the USA, the theaters are starting to open back up. And I think people are thirsty after having cabin fever for an entire year. Even if they're not a horror fan or a Saw fan, we'll probably have scooped up more viewers, because they're just like desperate to go and see a movie, any movie.
Right, right. Yeah. You know, I'm in Los Angeles and I'm seeing it. It's like everything's kind of springing to life again after a long, cold winter. So yeah, I got to see Saw on a big screen, and it was, you know, that's definitely part of, you know, what allowed me to completely lose myself and immerse myself in it. Congratulations on that. Joseph, I know you've got a pending release. We're all looking forward to seeing The Conjuring 3, aka The Devil Made Me Do It. That's coming out June 4th, I believe. You know, I actually met with Michael Chavez, the director, recently over on one of the mixing stages at Warner Studios. Had a chance to meet with him a little bit, see the first 10 minutes. Talked about your work on the soundtrack and how, you know, Conjuring 3 represents the first film that the Warrens are in the 1980s, and how you use kind of that era shift to experiment a little bit with the sounds. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, that was definitely a little bit of it. I tend to start, I hear orchestration as well as thematic things, and I tend to latch onto that and sort of go with it. And my response to this one, the very first thing I was hearing was this very specific configuration with a drummer on one side and a two-tiered layer of brass on the other side. And that was the very first session we did. Before, it was very early. I think they might have even not started shooting yet when I did that first session, which was a good year and a half ago. Yeah, we definitely started that one well before the lockdown. So it's kind of like Charlie. I will echo, it's nice to see that the things that went into hibernation come back to life.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So glad that everything's working out that way, and that your films are going to be received as they were intended. Blake, how's it going? Are we on the same wavelength?
I don't know. You tell me.
Oh, I think we are. Hey man, at least we got a few clips of you in the beginning, because you look fantastic. You know, I loved seeing your book covers there. But the main thing is to have you, you know, being able to bring your knowledge and expertise to this. So, you know, we'll struggle through. So glad to have you here. Why don't you take things from here, and let's get Mark and Christopher into the convo.
Yeah, one of the things that I've talked to many composers about in the horror genre is that there's this ability in the genre to create what wouldn't really be considered music by a traditional sense. And you don't necessarily even have to use traditional instruments and stuff. Mark, I know you have a device called the Apprehension Engine, which is creates all kinds of eerie noises. And I wonder if maybe you could start us off by talking a little bit about, you know, being able to use noise as an instrument, and, you know, whether it be pots and pans or this new instrument that you have in the horror genre, and how the genre kind of lets you express yourself in that way.
Sure. I'll just explain a little bit about this this wacky instrument that we came up with. I've always experimented with unusual ways of playing instruments, like guitar players know what an EBow is, right? It's like electronic bow for your guitar. but I've always loved jamming it into the pickup. So it just squeals and howls and just makes very rude noises. And I also liked jamming it into a spring reverb. So just slam it right in there and just have those springs howl. Doing things like that with it, sort of unusual uses. I'm a big hurdy-gurdy fan. And I loved using friction mallets. So I figured, well, let's make a box that incorporates all this stuff together in one unit. I think it's less of a musical instrument, and it's more like a Foley machine where you just go to different sections and play those sections. And I also I loop everything. So I've done live performances with this thing, and I go for like 45 minutes of just making very awful noise, and it's just so much fun, and it's really cathartic as well. All this tension that you're carrying, you just get it out, and by the end of it, you're feeling really great and really light. And I also totally forgot what your question was.
Well, it's about how the horror genre kind of allows you to do that. You know, you wouldn't be able to use that device in a traditional romantic comedy, for instance. But the horror genre allows to be more experimental. When you're composing a score, and now that you have this instrument and you know the sounds doesn't make, do you kind of hear that when you're kind of in the pre-production of composing?
Do I hear it? I wouldn't say I actually hear the apprehension engine, but certainly, since I don't really come from a horror background, I really only started in horror back in 2015 with The Witch, and I've done a bunch of horror films since then. But the further I got into it, the further I got away from traditional harmony, because I'm fairly well trained as a musician. But one of the first things I did after working with Rob Eggers was I abandoned click tracks altogether. I basically don't use clicks at all, and I've stopped thinking chordally as well. I just sort of let my fingers and let my ears guide where I'm going. I really love that freedom that's in horror, because I've always sort of thought like that. I've always loved musical surprises, and whatever kind of music it was, whether it's pop music or whatever, when my ears perk up and it's something unpredictable, that's what grabs me. It's just I really do not like predictable music at all. So I think I found the genre of music where I really fit, where I can be sort of as crazy as I was inside, and now I can get it out so other people can share in the insanity of it.
Well,
Yeah.
I just got to point out, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out how perfect it is that you play something called the apprehension engine. I mean, that could be the name of a horror movie right there.
For sure.
Chris, you've kind of been pigeonholed over the decades as kind of a big symphonic composer, but I know you have kind of a love for the more abstract, and you've gotten to do it with things like Sinister, and even a little bit in the one of the newest films, Empty Man. But you're able to kind of create that same mood and those same kinds of noises with the orchestra as well. Could you talk a little bit about kind of your desire to explore kind of the more abstract music, and how do you work it into the orchestral scores that you write?
Well, I think when everyone, gets into the film music scene, they kind of come with a picture in their mind of what they want to try to bring to the table, which maybe hadn't been done before. Now, before I moved out here, I fell madly in love with that whole Polish school thing. And in terms of the electronic end of things, I became kind of obsessed with the music concrete guys from France, and how that sort of spread its way into all those other countries overseas in the United States as well. So indeed, my dream was somehow, I loved, man, doing like walls of sound in which melody and harmony fell to the wayside. But I guess what's different about me from the other guys is that when I came to LA in the early 80s, the idea of, even in horror films, for the most part, you still needed to use at least a motive, if not a melody, to try to hold the whole party together. And so the tonality issue couldn't be abandoned. And yes, I love doing the Clouser stuff. I remember hearing my first Penderecki piece was called Utrenja. And now that language is used to frighten people, but for me, it was more like I was enlightened when I first heard that piece. It was like the voice of God. And so my thing was, I said, Jesus, I would love to create this, get involved in a movie where I can do this wall of sound of just sonic vomit, where I don't have to put it. Basically picture and sound all taken care of on my end. And so indeed, yes, after Hellraiser, I became the orchestra guy, but I was a closeted, electronic guy, only, as I said, mostly the concrete way of going, which would be record instruments and then transpose them down or whatever, simple little things to mess up the sounds. And so there was one movie I did called the remake of Invaders from Mars, which was directed by Tobe Hooper. And I did this. I said, here's my chance. He turned to me and said, listen, I'm looking for a score that is like just no tunes, no nothing. And I went, oh man, this is going to be so much fun. So I went out and did this kooky, crazy thing, which it was a remake of the movie Invaders from Mars. And so I delivered the score, started to deliver it, and I noticed I wasn't getting, any kind of positive response. And it was, I went out and recorded, like pile drivers and, went on trips to record sounds, remember I recorded, went to Grand Central Station, recorded all of the shower you get in there and then manipulating that. Anyway, it's a very exciting score, but it got tossed. And I think that kind of shut me down a bit afterwards. I kind of put a small hold on me going off the deep end with trying to do sound mass stuff. But of course, whenever given the chance, there's nothing more exciting than just to vomit, and let the orchestra go bananas and enhance it with electronics and just blast the room, to smithereens, to blow it up with
sonic
sound.
vomit. I'm gonna incorporate that term now into my everyday vernacular for sure, especially when I talk about music.
But yes, I was a closet synth guy, and it wasn't until Sinister really, when it finally I got to come out of the closet with that, because there was just no money to do anything but synth. And so I was thrilled, that in that picture I finally got to let that come out, so to speak. Sounds were always it was always in my head. It's just I was the orchestra guy. It was just go to Chris, because he'll take, got very little money, he'll figure out a way to make an orchestra sound bigger than what you would expect it to sound like, and for that money. And that was my thing. So, I'm addicted and love everything that horror can offer in terms of taking you to places that no other film type could possibly allow you to go.
Sure.
So
Charlie, with
hallelujah.
with Spiral coming out, and this is what, the 9th Saw movie that you've scored, and in the book Scored to Death 2, we talk a lot about each of the installments and how your approach kind of changes. Was there, without spoilers, is there a way you can talk about how this movie kind of changed your approach, and what new colors did you bring to the score that maybe aren't in the other ones?
Yeah, I mean, this, most of the Saw movies, 99% of the story and the action takes place in some dank, dark hallway with water dripping and flickering fluorescent lights usually, and they're usually indoors and it's dark. But in Spiral, a good chunk of the storyline and action takes place outdoors in daylight on the hottest day of the year, which is completely out of character compared to earlier Saw installments. And so, and that aspect, coupled with the fact that it's sort of a side street from the main Saw Avenue. This is a bit of a diversion from the traditional storyline of like the first brick of 8 movies. And so when I'm picking sounds and picking what to play with those sounds and just like assembling a sonic smorgasbord, I'm always operating in response to what I'm seeing on the screen. So, and for me, certain sounds and ways of playing and certain tempos sound like they're indoors or outdoors, or they're day or they're night. And so a lot of the sonic palette that became kind of familiar to the Saw fan base wasn't like appropriate for Chris Rock behind the wheel of his car on the hottest day of the year, sweat dripping down his face, driving fast on his way to a crime scene. So that was a kind of a welcome change, or a welcome set of circumstances, because that kind of helped define the sonic world that I was going to try to exploit. And that means using sounds that are more pointy and shorter and brighter, and rhythms that are more tension filled and sort of mid-rangey, and not, the previous sort of Saw soundscape would have these big girthy low rumbles and sort of distant, everything sounded distant and was drenched in reverb, like it was coming from down the hall and a third door on the left kind of sound. And that wasn't the visual vibe of Spiral. So that made it that much easier for me to kind of point my sounds in the direction of what I was seeing on the screen. Of course, there are plenty of scenes in Spiral that are dark and that we go into the familiar Saw sonic territory, but a whole big chunk of it is got a different feel. And that was kind of a welcome change, and to be able to use familiar Saw melodic and thematic material, but not with the same sound palette that I'd exploited so many times before.
Yeah. Joe, you've done many sequels and different series, and I know we already talked a little bit about the new Conjuring movie, The Devil Made Me Do It. Is there anything that, and I know it's not out yet, so I know you can't talk too much about it, but is there anything about it? It's the first one that's not directed by James Wan, though you have worked with that director before. Is there anything you can talk about how this new movie changed your approach? I know when we talked about, Conjuring 2, you talked about how that movie, you needed a male voice as opposed to female voice from the first Conjuring. Is there anything you can talk about for the third one?
Yeah, it's I mean, to me, they all exist in their own space. It's all kind of I have said this before, but it's like each world is sort of a different dialect of the same language. It's like the language is established, but now we're going off into this region or that region. And that's really where, I mean, I'll go back to the word orchestration again. That's where I just started hearing what I tend to hear it pretty early. It can start as early as a conversation or the script or just an idea from it. And I'll just start hearing something and it'll sort of stay with me. And it's kind of rendering in the background, no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm actually working or not. Often the work for me of pulling the sounds out happens rather unconsciously. I mean, I've I've laid down, had a nap, and woke up, and there's what I was looking for. It's just kind of, and it's so unpredictable. I've just kind of learned to just try to stay out of my own way and just kind of allow it to develop and happen. Of course, later there's the grind, and there's the editing, and there's the conforms, and there's new edits every day and all of that. But that's like the work. That's the different side. The part of just kind of hearing it and manifesting it is what I'm talking about.
But is there anything specific about this one you can talk about?
Yeah. So for this one, it was, again, I pulled it back to that. There was a piece of music I wrote for it was the first thing I wrote for The Conjuring, called The Soaring Entities. I just had this in talking with James about the Warrens cases and this whole kind of tapestry of supernatural occurrences. I just kind of had this vision of these floating beings, and it manifested as this quarter tone brass thing happening. And that's been sort of reinterpreted for every film. And for this one, ended up approaching it with this brass and drum setup that I was hearing. Brought in a drummer named Vinny Colaiuta. He used to play with Frank Zappa, and he's just a fucking badass. Super cool to just get to it's so satisfying to get to hear this thing and develop it and then have it played back in front of you. It's just, there's nothing like it. So it started with that. I was also hearing a female voice again. There was, the first Conjuring featured a vocalist, Diamanda Galas, who's just incredible. If you haven't heard her, by all means, look her up. As I told you, Blake, the second one was very much a male presence. So for that, went to London and recorded a 31 voice male choir, which was 30 basses and baritones and one single tenor, which was just awesome. For this one, I was also hearing a lot of female voices, one in particular, and went to a singer named Kristen Hayter, who records and performs under the name Lingua Ignota. And she was just incredible to work with and brought a really cool voice to this one, I think.
Can I just say real quick how I love that napping is part of your creative process? I'm gonna remember that, and then maybe use that when I'm feeling a little need a little creative inspiration as an excuse to just no. I think that's great though. I think that you actually can come up with a lot of cool stuff when you're in that like state in between awake and asleep.
Yeah. Mark, you've worked on a few television series recently. Does your process change when you're working on a series compared to a feature-length film?
Well, it's way more crafty.
In what way? What do you mean by that? When I'm working on a feature, it's a little bit more about inspiration and stuff like that. When I'm working on a series, it's more like, keep the assembly line moving, and you sort of get into that headspace. I mean, for a composer, it's the closest thing you can get to having a real job. So it's, the consistency of it is nice. But then, inevitably it can get pretty dull after a while. So for me, I like to mix it up, do a series, but not back-to-back series, because then you start to going crazy. So I like to have a balance there. Yeah.
So, do you mind if I ask a question to the other composers on the panel? Of
course, go for it.
What is everyone's take on temp score? Like when the temp score arrives with the film, how many of you go, well, we're just going to get rid of the temp score, we're going to start from scratch? How does it work with the other composers here?
Interesting question.
Chris, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. Once upon a time, a composer, depending upon their status, was able to insist on seeing the film for the first time without the temp. I remember Elmer Bernstein would not go into a theater to watch the film until they had removed the temp. Of course, Bernard Herrmann would have punched the director if he'd walked in and there was a temp score. my fantasy, of course, is to be able to watch the film naked the first time. How can you possibly have anything flopping, fly into your head as you're watching the picture if you're trying desperately to push the temp out of your head? It's interesting. I have looked at my old scores and I put them into two different categories. Ones in which I saw the film with the temp the very first time and had to adjust to it, to kind of do battle with it and to embrace certain elements of it and let it influence my choices in line with what the director was requesting. Those are the films I would call what might have been had I never heard the temp. Once you hear the temp, of course, there's no escaping it. Our musical brains are like flypaper. We hear it, it sticks. They can take it out, but you know what was there, and it's impossible not to make references to it. But there is nothing we can do about it except play ball. And so I've learned that over the years. I remember, I'm thinking now of The Dark Half with George Romero, and going to see that film for the first time, again, the Night of the Living Dead director. And it had temp in it. And I remember even asking my agent at the time, gee, could you see if he would be willing to take the temp out when I see it for the first time? And there was dead silence on the phone. And my agent said, what did you just say? I said, wow, is it possible to check this for you could take the temp out? And he goes, what, are you nuts? Get your ass over there. Listen to this thing with the temp, and so be it. So anyway, in answer to your question, I have to listen to what it is and use it as a means for the director to feel comfortable in being able to communicate in a language that he knows nothing about. The only way he can talk about music in the abstract, but now why not put a temp up to describe what it is? We don't, spotting now with movies with temp can be, oh, I like this cue, or I don't like this cue. What I like about this cue is this, what I don't like about it is that. I remember even going way back when I was working on Roger Corman movies. When I first started off, Roger Corman, the King of the Peace, I did a low budget film from him. They didn't have temp. They didn't have temp music. Hellraiser did not have a temp score. They just didn't do it back then, or at least the films I worked on didn't do it. And so the director was required to sit down and put his thinking cap on and go, okay, dramatically, this is what I'm looking for. He may go, and gee, I would love you to do a Jerry Goldsmith-like score for blah, 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 blah. He would talk in the abstract about things he was hoping it would be like, but he had to find words that describe what it was that he wanted the music to address by being very descriptive dramatically about what the scene required. As I said, with temp now, that kind of process is gone. They can immediately decide whether or not the temp is accomplishing what it needs to accomplish or not. So, and answer your question quickly, to shrink it down, we got to be smart. We have to work with it. Elmer Bernstein and Leonard Bernard Herrmann wouldn't be able to have a career now if they weren't willing to ride the wave.
Charlie, I feel like from our conversations that your view of the temp score, maybe that you're a little more easygoing when it comes to the temp score, and maybe find it even helpful in ways that some of the composers I've talked to don't.
Yeah, I mean, I on the face of it, I love a temp score because at least it shows that somebody thought about the problem, and the problem is, what the hell are we gonna do about the music? So at least somebody thought about it. Maybe they had a rousing success, and that's a case of, we love this cue, can you please ape it? Or maybe they were met with frustration and you're going to ride in on horseback to save the day. And that's a case of, we hate everything in the temp, please disregard it, but we had to put something there. But and it's interesting. I don't, I never get, I don't have the problem where I need to watch the movie without the music for the first time. I mean, I do have a mute button, so I can kill the temp at my place, as watch it without. But a lot of the time, you know, especially when I was doing network TV series and we were just racing madly to the finish line, and a lot of time there would be the schedule just wasn't compatible with, oh, we don't like this cue. Can you take another swing at it? In other words, when they hit the dub stage, they had to have the score. And if they didn't like a cue, they had to have an alt already done, already on another track muted. So I was a lot of times basically scoring episodes. And I'd score an episode of an hour-long drama. Maybe a third of the cues I would have 2 or 3 completely different pieces of music for those, because if they didn't like the first one, there was no time to go back and do another one. They had to already have version 2 and maybe a version 3. So I got very accustomed to hearing a scene with 2 or 3 different approaches just of what I was doing, let alone what they had temped it with. And then, you know, the other side of it is, you know, even if I love the temp and set out to exactly ape it and copy its tempo map and have the drums start where their drums start and try to get as close as I can, basically what I call parking my car in their spot. Even if I set out to do that, by the time it's done, it's completely different. And I've lost myself to the flow of my own music and what direction that was pulling me in. And I'm definitely guilty of, you know, promising someone in a meeting that I'm going to do this and I'll do it like this, just the way we've discussed it. And then I get sucked down the roaring rapids of creativity and wind up doing something completely different, which is always, so far it's always worked. But so I guess all those factors together combine to make me not need to hear it not need to see a movie for the first time with no temp, because I'll forget what the temp was anyway by the time I get started.
Yeah. Interesting.
What about you, Mark? Since you asked the question, what are your views on it?
Oh, well, I mean, for me, it's really a double-edged sword. I mean, you know, I've worked on films where I would have no idea what to do in a particular scene, and the temp was just brilliant, and it would take me in a whole new direction that I never thought of. Other times they've tempted in with something that is just absolutely astoundingly awful, and they've fallen in love with it because they've heard it like 500 times.
Yeah.
And if you hear anything 500 times, you know, you get used to it. It becomes the thing. So lately I've had some good experiences where the director, he refused to let me hear the temp score. I actually wanted to hear the temp score, and he said, no, you're not going to hear the temp score because I want to see what you would imagine for this. And I think I came up with something pretty cool. I found out late in the game that there actually was a temp score. In the beginning, I thought there was no temp score, but there was, but he wouldn't let me hear it. So, you know, like I said, it's good and bad. I mean, the worst case scenario is when they fall in love with really terrible music, and you sort of have to ape it.
Yeah. Josh, do we have viewer questions, or should I keep going?
We do. No, this is a really good time to jump into a few of these questions. We got one for Christopher. It was talking about how Nightmare on Elm Street 2 has become so iconic for so many reasons. So it must be interesting to look back on that film specifically. What are your memories of working on that film?
My memory of working on that film they're great memories. Of course, when I got the opportunity to do that film, it was like heaven on earth. I just finished UCLA, and it was like, wow. You know, I was in the composition department. How could this is like heaven. And here's the thing is, when I came on board, I love the film the score that Charles Bernstein did for the first score, but it was a synth one. When I came on board, they definitely wanted to go orchestral. And so they said, we have the same amount of money that we had for the first one. Can you give us an orchestra score? And that was sort of my selling point at that time. Listen, I'll figure out a way to get an orchestra for you. Don't worry about it. It was the big bang for the buck. And you add an orchestra to a movie and the production value would go up and all that. So I remember that I made a promise I would get together an orchestra of about 35 people. And that was recorded at the Mad Hatter, which is out of business. That was Chick Corea's studio. And they claim they never got as many musicians in that studio before or after that, before they knocked it down. But Bob Shea, who ran New World Pictures, not New World, New Line Pictures, I remember him coming. And the first thing he did when he walked into the studio is he looked to the glass window and I watched him counting the heads because I promised them 35. And he turned around and he looked at me and he gave me the thumbs up and he was very happy. So, I mean, it was an exciting score. And that one, my big weird color, I bought a couple of weird things into that. I think I got the only guy who played a sarrusophone on that. It was a sarrusophone and then whale sounds, humpback whale sounds buried in
Nice.
that I manipulated. So that was fun.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the questions we got have actually been answered. You know, someone was asking Joseph about what you could tell us about The Conjuring. Someone was asking Charlie about keeping the Saw franchise soundtrack fresh after all these installments. We really kind of went over those, but here's a fun one that I can throw out to everyone here. What's your instrument of choice when it comes to scoring horror? Joe, why don't you kick us off?
I can't say I have an instrument of choice. It really depends what it is. I mean, I guess the first instrument I go to is I just try to be quiet, honestly, and listen and just kind of see what am I hearing, and that'll determine if I'm going to approach something at the piano or just on paper or on something else. I tend to do a lot of pre-planning before I even sit down to write a single thing. It's like, it seems that to just sit down and write is just like where and when, why, and with what. So I really like to just work out what I'm doing before I even approach the picture.
That's awesome. How about you, Charlie?
I'd have to say anything made of metal that I can use a violin bow on. And I have there's a lot of them here of different sizes and shapes, but you know, and I know everybody on the panel probably has a water phone lying around, and I have a few of them, but I never use water in them. I always play them dry because then the pitch is stable, and I generally use all these bowed metal instruments to create individual samples, which I can then play in the sampler inside the computer and be able to use them as a melodic device. When you're sitting in front of it, a lot of times there's wrong notes, weird notes, half-assed notes. So I do spend a lot of time sampling those type of instruments so that I can swap out what might normally be strings or other instruments and use metallic tones. And I will put in a plug for one of my favorite and most used samples, which what Christopher was talking about earlier reminded me of when he was talking about going to Grand Central and recording crazy crowd ambiances and stuff. Is I have this sound that's, and I know I've talked about it before, but it was the sound of the subway pulling into the 72nd Street station.
Nice.
And the brakes squealing in the subway tunnel. And you know, I used to sit there waiting for the subway. This was probably 1983 or so, and the pitch of that high squeal, and I recorded on a cassette Walkman, and I still use that original samples that I did on a cassette Walkman because for some reason, it had a stable pitch, and when you play it in the sampler at various pitches, it sounds like strings, but not strings. And of course, it's made of metal, so it's a natural fit for a Saw movie.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
It's worth noting that if anybody, there's videos on YouTube where Charlie's showing off some of his metal bowed instruments. So if anybody wants to see the kind of thing he's talking about, there's plenty of videos online of those things.
Nice. I have a feeling I know your answer, Mark.
Yeah, and that answer is?
A little thing called an apprehension engine.
No, I think my favorite thing is just accidental things that occur around the house. Like if someone moves a big table, and it goes, it's this howl that you get there, things like that. I'll go, whoa, sample that quick. Or, opening a door or whatever it is, the washing machine has malfunctioned, pull out the recorder, start recording. Like I said, I'm about accidents. I love being surprised by sounds. And I like to just wander around the house, just sort of, one of the best sounds, I used it in a TV series. We have this old ironing board. And when you open it up, because it's made of, these metal parts that really need a lot of oil. And it's the most god awful shriek imaginable. Your teeth grate. And I use that all over the score that I just did. I love the sound so much.
Fantastic. Y'all surprising me. Christopher, do you have a favorite when it comes to scoring horror?
Well, it's interesting. As Charlie was mentioning the brake squeak from the subway, I got it immediately in my head because I lived in New York City for a while. It's not only the squeak, but it's also the acoustics of the subway, down the underground subway, and how that resonates. If you've done that New York subway thing, it's quite remarkable. But I'm going to say that, I was thinking about this. There is certainly no one instrument that I run to when I'm writing. Of course, I sit at a piano, but I would say, because I'm an ex-percussionist, I have a drummer, I have tons and tons of percussion instruments. I would say chances are, if I'm going to fiddle around with a sound, it's probably going to be generated from a percussion instrument. Yes, medals with bows, one of my favorite things too. But interestingly, the more I thought about it, I said, I still love going to the piano. The piano offers an endless supply, a never-ending supply of magical things that you never thought you could get it to make happen sonically. So somewhere sooner or later, there's probably going to be something very strange happening with the piano in my scores. And I do a lot of breathing. I use my voice a lot, actually. It appears in some of the pictures.
Nice. Fantastic. We are nearing the end of our hour already. I mean, I really feel like I could keep on with you guys for ages. I want to give you all a chance to talk about what you're working on next. But before that, Blake, do you have a final question for any of our panelists or for the group of them?
Yeah. I've been lucky enough to see some of these guys' studios, and I know that they sometimes keep weird hours. They're locked up in dark rooms by themselves most of the time. When you're working on a horror picture, has there been a horror movie that you're working on where you actually get kind of freaked out when you're like working late at night or something? Has any of them actually scared you?
That's a great question. Who said no?
I said no.
Oh, wow. You got nerves of steel, my man.
There was a scene, and everyone asked me, don't you get grossed out or freaked out by these films or that you work on? I remember there was a scene in the film Hellbound, which was a sequel to Hellraiser, so I thought was pretty gross.
Oh, we're familiar at Dread Central with the works of Clive Barker and Hellbound specifically.
But other than that, I mean, no, I don't frighten too easily. No, I guess we get so accustomed to it, it becomes just second sort of, it's a life we live in. Right? Yeah.
Well,
and the rest of you guys.
Well, one benefit to at least scoring modern, horror films in the modern era is that in a Saw movie, the cut that I get when someone's arm has just been pulled out of the socket, that's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is a guy with a big green sock on one arm because they're going to CGI the yanked off arm. So that kind of kills any suspension of disbelief when there's a card that comes up that says, VFX blood splatter missing. So that doesn't get scared. You can't be scared of a card that says VFX missing.
Not even the creepy dolls of Dead Silence or anything like that.
Mark?
Well, yeah, for me, working on a horror score, it doesn't bother me in the least, the images, because I just look at it, it's just theater to me, Yeah. I used to work on documentaries, and I remember working on a documentary called Shake Hands with the Devil about the Rwanda genocide. And I remember working on a certain scene, and I just couldn't watch it anymore. I had to turn it off because it was real horror. You know, this was not theater. This was actually happening. And that's the stuff that really affects me. And you know, I can watch almost any horror movie except for something like that. And I also can't watch these guys that are on you know, a skateboard at the top of a skyscraper skating around. You know, that
Oh yeah.
freak out. You know, so that's
No, I know exactly what you're talking about, especially when they add that fisheye lens and you already feel like you're falling.
Oh yeah, no.
Yikes. What about you, Joseph? Have you ever freaked yourself out working on a film?
No.
Oh, y'all got nerves of steel.
I know Joe doesn't scare easily.
I mean, every now and then there's been moments where it's been late and I'm overtired and who knows what else, and been working on something, and something comes together where I'll just get a flash vision of something, and it'll just get the slightest tingle, chill. That's when I know it's like, it just kind of makes me giggle, because it just takes me back to a time when I actually did get scared by things. And
nothing's made you look over your shoulder and think there's something in the room.
No.
You're all jaded, but you know, hey, if that's what it takes to hone those skills to allow you guys to keep doing what you're doing, then I'm all for it. Well, listen, I want to go around and hear what everyone's working on now. And Joseph, let's start with you. Besides, obviously, The Devil Made Me Do It, coming out on June 4th. What are you currently working on?
I'm working on a film called Lullaby, which is it's the fourth film that I started before the pandemic that went into shutdown, and everything seemed to wake up in November. A film called The Unholy, which was called Shrine at the time.
Right.
And then Malignant, which comes out in August or September. Another really cool film with James Wan, and then Conjuring, and now Lullaby. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Fantastic. Can't wait to hear them all. Charlie, how about you? Now that Spiral has premiered, what are you currently cooking?
I'm going to score my first ever documentary over the summer, which should be interesting, and got sucked into this project that is just such an interesting topic that it kind of drew me in. And it's about a weird confluence of social unrest and an artistic movement, and how the two events and their timelines collided and crossed, and how a creative artistic movement actually affected this social unrest situation. And it was within our lifetimes, and I won't say anything more other than that, but it's when I hope that people, when they see it, will think, as I did, you know, I never thought of that. But now that it's been shown to me, it makes complete sense. So that should be interesting.
Yeah, that's quite a hook. You definitely got me curious. Be sure to let us know.
I will.
How that's going, because it sounds like something we definitely want to follow. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I do have a few things going on. There's like a Netflix horror thing and a couple of horror features, and after that is like a sci-fi series, which sounds really cool, but because of these stupid NDA agreements, I can't say a word about it. I talked to my agent today. He says, nope, you can't say a thing about these things. You signed.
It's a shame, but you know, great to hear though that you're doing so much work. You know, obviously we love what you're doing, and we want to see more and more of it. Christopher, what are you working on these days?
Yeah, I'm really blessed in that Millennium Films have come to me on a couple of films. One that's happening now, one that's going to be happening later. The one I'm starting on now is called Abazu. It's a wonderful devil possession film, female,
Nice.
which is nice.
Yeah, we like those.
Yeah, well, I've done a lot of devil films for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to follow with that up with a film called Piper, which is a retelling of the Piper from Hamelin, you know, the Pied Piper story.
Nice.
And it's very nice. And that one has an interesting musical task that I have to fill, and that is I have to write a flute concerto for that ultimately, because they're going to be using that as part of the storyline, and they're going to be filming an orchestra playing this flute concerto or parts of it, because again, it is about the Pied Piper of Hamelin.
Right.
This is unusual and very exciting. So,
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to check it out. We'll definitely be following up with you to hear how that progresses. Hey, Blake, my co-moderator, I want to give you a chance to talk about what you got going on. Scored to Death Part 3?
Not yet, but Score to Death and Score to Death 2 are books, and they're available on Amazon, from other book retailers, or from me directly at scoretodeath.com. I just started doing a podcast for the Cinematic Sound Radio Network. And the reason why I started doing it there is because he's managed to figure out the licensing stuff so that, things are legal, and hopefully all these composers and stuff get paid. But I started a podcast there called Score to Death Radio, and I get to play DJ for an hour and play some of my favorite horror cues. The first episode starts off with something from Charlie, and so far I've had the first 2 episodes are featuring all the composers in the second book. And I'm going to try to do that monthly. I'll see what I can do to keep that up. But get to do mixtapes, some playlists of some horror cues.
Fantastic.
That's
cool.
The new thing.
Well, that's something we can absolutely get behind. I want to thank you, Blake, for being a co-moderator and bringing your experiences with these guys and your expertise to the forefront this evening. I think it really helped enhance the conversation. And I want to thank all of my panelists. I mean, I said it at the beginning, this really has been an all-star panel. I think this is going to be one that I'm going to remember for a long time, when I had the honor of sitting down with 4 or 5 such really talented musicians who are all making such important inroads in the horror landscape, the genre we all love. So thank you for giving your time this evening. Stick around for a minute. But for the rest of us, the rest of you guys who have been watching, thank you for tuning in. It's been a fantastic time. Thank you for submitting all of your thoughtful questions. Thanks to my team at Dread Central for backing me up on the tech side. And we'll be doing more of these. We actually have another Dissecting Horror panel tomorrow. Tell you all about it over on Dread Central. But for right now, have a great evening, everyone. Good night.